Hi, hello, and welcome to Garuda's Corner here on YouTube. I am your host, Garuda, and this video is going to be a long one, but it's going to be worth it. This is a continuation of the debate that the channel Lit with Charles started on his video, Why BookTok is Terrible for Literature. A magnificent, short video, roughly 10 minutes long. Magnificent video with great arguments, and I will revisit some of his arguments and state some other ones, some new ones. But first of all, I will preface this by saying that I have a graduation I have graduated in literary studies and linguistics, and I have a master's in literary studies. And yes, I am a bit of an elitist bastard when it comes to literature, but just so you who are listening to me understand what I'm saying, one of my favorite novels is a noir novel. So when I say elitist bastard, I don't mean necessarily canonical novels, canonical authors, but I mean quality in some very difficult to define but existent way. And let me revisit what Charles said in his video. He spoke about the Parker effect when it comes to wine. There was this guy that had a mailing list in which he spoke about wines and criticized some wines and complimented others. And well, criticism technically involves complimenting and talking bad about something, so I'm gonna use the word criticism in this vast sense. And you may excuse my coughing, I am very ill, but I wanted to record this. So the Parker effect is summing up is the fact that this guy's opinions shaped the wine industry. He complimented a wine, and the next week that wine was sold out on every market because people just, I don't know, couldn't have an opinion and they just had to abide by his opinion on his mailing list. The same happens with literature, right? With BookTok, someone compliments a book and they are a bookfluencer or BookInfluencer, and that is valid for Instagram, for YouTube, for whatever you are. I'm just going to use BookTok as a compressed term to refer to all those book influencers. And so they compliment a book, and then the next week the book is sold out on every goddamn bookstore, bookshop, all around the country, or even all around the world. This makes the very publishing industry bet on those books and books that are similar to that, and stop betting on what we call bibliodiversity. Just exactly the same way we have biodiversity when it comes to living beings, there exists bibliodiversity, right? And it is just like biodiversity, bibliodiversity is a sign of a healthy environment, of a healthy ecology. In this case, of a healthy literate society, right? This is not to say that people should be reading conspirational shit or neo-Nazi bullshit. That's not reading. That's not valid bibliodiversity. That's like every animal in the whole ecology having cancer. You know, that's not diversity. That's just disease spread out. But excluding those extreme bullcraps, there is plenty of diversity out in the wild, right? So again, to the Parker effect, it even shapes the very form of the literature that is being promoted and complimented, and which the industry is gonna bet on, because it has to imitate or mirror in some way the experience of the very fast scrolling experience that these people have with platforms like TikTok. So longer paragraphs, deeper philosophical, reflexive digressions, more structured, complicated sentences, those are all shunned out, they're all eliminated from the books because the consumer, which is not even a reader anymore, it's just a book buyer, it's just a consumer, should not have their reading speed affected by these. And Charles also mentioned something very, very excellent, very aptly put, which is Marcel Proust or William Faulkner or whoever it is wouldn't be published authors today because they would not have enough followers, they would not be big enough influencers. This is essential because this changes what being a writer, being an author means. It meant up until a few decades ago, like 3 decades ago, 2.5 decades ago, being an author, even maybe 2 decades ago, being an author meant writing a book good enough, or a novel, a poetry collection, a short story collection. I'm not gonna say essays, but maybe essays. That was good enough that it gathered a reading community around it, that it gathered readers, because people read it and they were like, oh wow, this is good. This is actually good, right? I want to know who's the author. This is good. I'm going to read something else they put out after this because this is good enough. Nowadays, it's nothing like that. Nowadays, the supposed author needs their reading community, their viewership already established to then have access to the publishing market, which is ridiculous. Because what are these people going to read? These supposed authors, which are influencers basically, have not yet written anything. Or they have not shown snippets of what they write. And even then, we cannot have any guarantees that it's not just a ghostwriter, which is fine. Okay, ghostwriters existed in history, but still. I mean, in other historical moments, but still. We never see that in a good light, right? So the whole ecology changed. On top of that, I believe BookTok reifies, if you know the technical vocabulary, it commodifies the book. The book becomes merely a visual prop for those videos. And it's really funny because I mentioned BookTok and then I said, well, book influencers from TikTok, which is a video platform, Instagram, which is a visual platform too, and then YouTube, which is a video platform too. None of those are textual platforms, right? So they're not like forums or something. So we see an indirect but relevant, meaningful relation between being more literate and not being so influenced. But I'm not gonna dive into that. I'm just gonna leave it here. But again, BookTok commodifies books themselves. The very book object, right? Because the book is now just a scene prop. It's just scenery. It's just background material for a video. It's not there to be read. It's there to be hauled, book haul videos or unboxings or stuff like that, right? Or those bookshelves behind the people on the videos that have their books organized by color, for example. What use is that? I being an academic, being a scholar, my books are organized by the author's surname and then the title in alphabetical order. So Giorgio Agamben, because his surname starts with A, with the first letter of the alphabet, of the Latin alphabet, is the first author in my, well, he's not the first one, but is one of the first ones in my shelves. And then the books that he wrote, that I have, that I own, in alphabetical order of the title. Because that's useful, because if I forget the book's title itself, I can just reach to that section because all his books are there, right? So I know it's there. When someone organizes their shelves by color, like, what's the use of that? So you see that it's a person that doesn't reach out for the shelf that often, or if they reach out only for entertainment. And even though that is fine at first glance, literature itself, fiction itself, has to be read with a certain seriousness that is completely, utterly lacking in the BookTok community. in the book influencing sphere. That's whenever, again, I repeat, whenever I say book talk, think of every book influencer from all those visual centered social medias, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, etc. I'm talking about those people. So again, the book, because of the book talk influence, books are not sold because of the reading experience they provide, because of the textual content they have, but because of this public performance of consuming literature, right? Publishers themselves, big publishing houses themselves, are gonna use, and are using already, they have been using for quite some time now, BookTok and the book influencing sphere as a sort of a thermometer, as a sort of a measuring scale of what is zero risk safe publishing choices, of what are safe publishing choices, right? They are not gonna bet on avant-garde, experimental, or just new stuff that doesn't have to be outright experimental, but it's just new, it's just different from everything that is out now. They're not gonna bet on that because they can bet on winning horses, on something that they know is gonna sell out. You know, this also shuns away smaller independent presses that historically served to publish risky new literature, because no one is going to buy those things, and no one is going to even see those smaller publishing houses. And I can confidently talk about this because I work in one, in an independent, ridiculously small. We are about to publish our second novel, a novella technically, is very short. And our very first novel was finalist on a national prize, on a national literary award, and no one's buying that because no one sees it. It doesn't get enough views on Instagram. But it was a finalist. It was one of the best. So quality is not assessed by the market in any way. Terry Egerton, in his Introduction to Literary Theory book, I forgot the specific title. I think it's Literary Theory and Introduction. I think that's the name of the book, the title of the book. He has, in one of the later sections of the book, he has one of the best counter arguments to sales numbers being a quality assessment. Sales numbers are not quality assessment, have never been, or if they were a quality assessment like 3,000 years ago, but not anymore. And I mean literally 3,000 years ago. That's not a figure of speech, an exaggeration. I mean literally when capitalism didn't exist outright, so it was some sort of quality assessment. And even then there were other factors, right? Like transport limitation and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into that topic, but even then, maybe sales figures were not quality assessment in any way. Also, those book influencers are doing free work, right? They are doing unpaid labor because they get those books for free, yes, but then they quote-unquote criticize what they talk about. They are not properly literary critics. If anything, they're the opposite of literary critics, actually. But they talk about those books, and that is just free marketing for those publishing companies, for those big publishing conglomerates. And it's basically for free, because the book itself, the physical paper thing, is very much inexpensive. It's a technology that we have developed well enough that it's much more inexpensive than it was 200 years ago. Well, than 100 years ago, actually. So, those huge publishing companies and conglomerates are gaining unpaid labor for free. Well, unpaid, it's for free, right? It's unpaid labor. And the book influencers that get the books, they feel like they belong in a certain community. They feel like they are participating in something, but they are just being exploited in a very soft, unspoken manner, but they are. The BookTok, the book influencers jargon, the specific language they use to discuss literature is itself impoverishing of the literary experience. When they talk about literature, they always dissect it in terms of tropes. And it's not even the sophisticated, extremely humorous way that a website like TV Tropes used to talk about. I suppose TV Tropes still exists, talks about series and video games and even novels. It's a highly humorous, highly satirical website, and a highly satirical employment of the idea of a trope. No, it's nothing like that. The BookTok, the book influencer's way of talking about literature, of dissecting it through tropes, is extremely mechanical and almost binary. Like, people are using too many binary machines, like smartphones and computers, and now they're thinking in binaries. Enemies to lovers, grumpy versus sunshine, found family. Like, what's the use of that? The great literary critic and theater historian Peter Zondi, S-Z-O-N-D-I, Zondi, I think that's how it's pronounced. I don't know how his name is actually pronounced. But Peter Zondi has one of the best sentences when it comes to that. It's in a text about literary hermeneutics, how to interpret literature, in which he is discussing if a certain section of a poem by Hölderlin is a metaphor or not. And he is saying, we cannot predict that. We have to read the poem and figure out if it is a metaphor or not. It is sort of a choice that we make. It is a decision that we take when we are interpreting the poem. And this means that whenever we're dealing with literature, we have to deal with literary texts as individuals, not exemplars. These are his precise words in German. We have to deal with the literary text as an individual, not as an example, as an exemplar. BookTok, the book influencing sphere, does the very opposite of what Zondi recommends. It deals with literature as example always. It is always just another token, just another instance, just another realization of this or that trope, right? The enemies to lovers or whatever, or the vampire falling in love with a human or something. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's the opposite of dealing with the text that is in front of the person, of seeing anything particular, specific, singular to that text that is not shared by any other text that makes them love it. So, because I could give an example from music, just to walk a little bit away from literature. We may look up a certain musical genre on Wikipedia or wherever you want to look up the musical genre, and we may listen to the artists and composers and bands that belong to that musical genre. But we will like one artist and not another, because, well, they make music in a certain way and not another that attracted us for some reason, that we enjoyed for some reason. It's the same with literature. I may enjoy comedy of manners, but I don't enjoy every writer and every novel that has been published under that specific genre, right? So back to the discussion. BookTok's and book influencers' approach to literature seizes approaching literature as a complex organism that has its peculiarities that have to be faced as an individual, which can be ambiguous and contradictory, and start seeing it as just slices of pre-digested market share. It's almost as if literature becomes an analog algorithm, right? It's not a digital algorithm like in a computer or a smartphone or a social media, but it's a physical analog algorithm. And this comes hand in hand with the lack of love for language, right? BookTok and book influencers' way of dealing with literature demands that literature is just another form of film scripting, of film screenwriting. It has to be action-packed. It has to be focused on dialogue, and with the recent, not so recent, discovery that most book talkers don't read the books, they just read the dialogues, it is even more evident. What I'm saying is even more evident, is even more explicit, right? They don't want extended, rich metaphors or analogies or comparisons. They don't want sometimes ambiguous metonymies or anything like that. They don't want any sort of friction with language. They don't want to deal with language. They just want a linguistic flattening that renders literature merely another form of screenwriting. And even the authors themselves, when they are aiming at that market, when they're just watching book influencers to see what is trending and what they ought to do, they start to realize that they have to limit themselves, limit their vocabulary, limit their syntactic structure, that sentence choices, so that it can be translated immediately and it can be transformed, adapted to visual, to series, Netflix series, TV series, cinema. So they have to limit themselves. Instead of writing with their full verbal ability, they have to limit themselves to this sort of adaptability to translation and to an easy, quick translation, because if it's hard enough and if it takes long enough, it's not going to be translated, right? Because everyone's cutting corners, everyone is searching for profits, and adapt the ease of adaptation, right? Easy adaptation to visual media. The book covers themselves suffer from this, and that they stop being designed to the touch into being coherent with the literary text, and they start being just this color splash, the saturated color splash that has to designed to grab the attention in a thumbnail that is gonna show up in a 6-inch screen during half a second of scrolling. So how is that even supposed to work? It's gonna become this color splash that is not gonna be tactile, it's not gonna be coherent with the text, it's not gonna be even coherent with the typography and the typesetting used inside, and it's gonna be very colorful, and sometimes that fits, obviously, fantasy, or I don't know, well, there can be dark fantasies, but sometimes you need something more gray, more tuned down, more quiet. Besides that, another issue that the book influencing sphere, that the BookTok sphere created, another issue, is the anxiety inducing anxiety in the viewership, right? Because if they read 20, 25, 30 books a month, then the viewer that actually has a functional life, has a job, has a family, or they don't even have that many things to do, but they do other things beside reading books in their free time. They are full-fledged humans that do many things. They're gonna feel they're lagging behind, and they're gonna feel that they have to just devour pages on end to finish as many books a month they can. But that is not good literacy. That is not good reading. That is awful reading. That is awful literacy. That is just injecting hustle culture and late stage, highly accelerated capitalism into reading, which was supposed to be a place in which these things were not supposed to be. Reading was supposed to be an oasis from those things, a moment away from those vile, awful influences. So if the reader feels compelled, and they will feel compelled from those reading challenges, to read as many books as they can, as many pages as they can, in as little time as they can, they're not going to reflect on it. They're not going to think of what they read, associate it with what they feel, what they remember, what they already know. And yes, I'm talking about literature. I'm not even talking about philosophy or some science. Nothing like that. Some science reading. Nothing like that. I'm actually discussing literature, fiction, poetry, short stories, novels, novellas. I'm talking about that kind of thing. Because it is also a form of knowledge in its own right. It is not the same kind or the same type of knowledge that we have, I don't know, in chemistry or physics. Of course it isn't. If someone thought of that, they're blatantly stupid. But it is a form of knowledge. There is something to learn from reading literature. It is not the same that we learn in school and even in academia, in higher education, but it is a form of knowledge and it's something that we can learn. This comes packaged with the visual reduction, the visual fetishization of literature. So I'm not a reader. I am just in dark academia, gothic, whatever. Well, the pile of old books in that wooden table is not just for visual props. It's not just for visual grabs, for taking a picture or two or a video. At least historically, right? Those paintings of people reading under candlelight were because they were so obsessed with reading, they wanted to understand what they were reading, and information was so scarce and so precious that they had to read even under precarious candlelight to appease that information hunger, that knowledge hunger. It's not information. Information is a mathematical concept. It's knowledge, it's proper wisdom, right? Which can only be conveyed through language. The many languages that exist, but still language. BookTok commentary and BookInfluencer's commentary on literature is also part of the problem, because instead of doing proper literary criticism, which, as Maurice Blanchot explained very well in Le Trémon and Sade, one of his best books, literary criticism means expanding the powers that the literary work shows through other means than literature itself. So instead of writing another novel to follow up from the novel I just read, I discuss things that show up in that novel in an enriching and flourishing manner, using philosophy, psychology, linguistics, history, cultural studies, anthropology, whatever you will. It is extending the power of that fictional work through other means than doing more fiction. This is nothing similar to what book talkers and book influencers in general do. They actually and majorly do moral judgment of characters, and that's basically it. Characters and situations, to be precise. And they use pseudo-psychological concepts to do that, right? Trigger warnings, toxicity, toxic relationships. Those are not exactly psychological concepts. Psychology is far more sophisticated and rich than that, right? But book talkers and book influencers in general have a chronic incapacity. They lack the capacity to separate artistic representation of something with the moral endorsement, the moral support of that same thing. Because precisely they cannot deal with literature for what it is. And this is something I wrote out in the first chapter of my master's dissertation. It is the theoretical introduction, and in it I state that literature is a specific use of language which does not abide by the notions of truth and falsity, because it is not veracity, it's not a truth-based discourse. Use of language. Discourse just means use of language. It is not that. That is reserved for journalism and news. That is reserved for science. That is reserved for personal confessions, for self-talk, talking about oneself. But it is not pertaining to literature. Literature sits outside of the truth-falsity distinction, or true-falsity schism, if you will. But book talkers and book influencers cannot even fathom this. And to try to wrap up the video, this to be read, the piles of to be read books that neuroticize the viewer as if they are lagging behind, and destroy literature as a refuge from the world, from the fast-paced hustle culture that kills us all, because I'm not going to pretend it is a good thing, it is one of the worst things to happen to us, makes literature become a source of anxiety and even inadequacy, of feeling inadequate. It has to do with FOMO, yes, fear of missing out. It has to do with book hauling and just gathering books in general. What for? You know, rereading is one of the best practices, and one of the best practices related to a deeper, richer literacy than just reading everything once, right? Memory and attention, focused awareness do not work like scrolling. They are contrary to, they are the opposite of it. We have to revisit things many times to consolidate them in memory, right? This fast-paced reward scrolling addicted brain also necessitates that literature itself is filled with attention-grabbing strategy. So every 3 pages there's a plot twist, every 5 pages there's an emotional hook, there's some sort of hook, and every 7 pages there's, I don't know, a cliffhanger. So literature itself loses its patient qualities. And the readers themselves stop being cognitively capable of sustaining long focused attention on a single task, which is what rendered possible to have nuance, to have details in fiction. If you cannot follow a long paragraph describing the inner turmoils of a certain character and understand that it pertains to that one character, and all of that is going to show up implicitly on the next interaction that character has with another character, then you cannot even follow what is happening, right? You have to feel the pressure of all that inner turmoil that was exposed through a long paragraph or two of inner dialogue or description or reflection or whatever. You have to retain that in memory when they dialogue with another character later on, right? If you cannot do that, you cannot appreciate what is happening in the text in the first place. And to finish it off, reading has historically always been one of the few isolated practices that was celebrated socially. It was done in isolation. A person reads on their own, separated from other people, but this is considered good, or was considered something good, right? This allowed reading, especially fiction, to create a sort of a safe laboratory for the reader's emotional processing. They could face and feel things evoked by the reading, by reading poems, by reading stories, and they could face those things in the privacy of that moment, in the isolation of that moment. Holland Barthes, another magnificent literary critic and theorist that is only brought up in the book influencing sphere to talk about the death of the author, which is an extremely misunderstood and misinterpreted text by the immense majority of book influencers, which is no surprise to me because they are extremely illiterate when it comes to literary theory, as they should be, because if they weren't, they wouldn't be book influencers in the first place. But still, Holland Barthes has a saying in another book. I think it's in English. I think it's called, the book is called The Rustle of the Voice or something like that, in which he talks about when we raise our eyes from the page and just glance at nothing. That moment is part of the reading experience. It's part of this emotional processing that I'm talking about. This used to be a defining trait, a defining characteristic of the reading practice. It is not anymore. With BookTok and BookInfluencer's sphere in general, reading has to be immediately rendered explicit and exteriorized to other people, transformed into short-form content and memes, and performed for the video camera and for those viewing, for the viewership, right? It has to be witnessed to have being considered taking place, to be considered that it happened, right? Eliminating this secrecy and isolation dimension of reading means that the BookTok and the book influencers basically destroyed the possibility of subjective transformation that literature offered originally, and the experience of reading it offered originally. So they deprived literature and reading literature from one of its defining traits, of one of its defining capacities and characteristics. They basically decharacterized it. They destroyed it, right? With that said, I don't want to extend much longer, but I remember reading a medical article. It was open access, but I don't remember the title right now. It had 4 or 5 authors. It was a large bibliography review. They were reviewing other medical researches that were done prior to them. It's usually called meta-analysis. That's what they were doing. And it's from the late 2024, I think December 2024, if I'm not mistaken. And in there, they concluded that smartphone reliance, short-form content consumption, and what people would call overconsumption, change the brain's anatomy, changes the amount of gray matter, literally how much brain you have. And it's for the worse, obviously. It affects memory, attention, motor function, so the ability to move through space and in spatial awareness, which is obviously related to motor function, into awareness in general, attention, and even what is called social emotional regulation and inhibitory control. So control to inhibit one's own urges and instincts to behave socially acceptable, to behave like a damn proper human being instead of an animal wearing clothes, right? Anyone that has taught in basic education recently, like I did for the last 3-4 years, knows that this is happening. Children are becoming brainless monsters that have no notion of anything. They have no notion of personal space. They cannot focus their attention for more than 13-12 seconds. And I measure that. I'm not exaggerating. They cannot understand anything they read. And one of the conclusions from that meta-analysis, from that medicinal meta-analysis that I read, was that smartphone reliance, short-form content consumption affects the ability to learn language and to use it. In 2014, when I got into the undergraduate, 12 years ago, I said the smartphone age is the arch enemy of the literate human. And 12 years later, this is being proven day in, day out. I'm being proven sadly correct day in, day out. So all that I want to say is, let's read, and let's read properly, my friends. lest we want to become brainless bastards like those that we see out there, and I don't want to be one of them. Thank you.